good morning and thanks for joining us. So before we start, I've just been told that there will be a fire drill at 11 AM, but we should be finished by then, so hopefully that won't disrupt our event. By the door are sign-in sheets. Please give us your email addresses because we'd love to send you more stuff. And we also have a box there for business cards if you would like to leave your business card instead. I'll also start by saying we're filming the event. I'm sure you've all seen the camera there, and I'm sorry that it's in an awkward position vis-a-vis the sign-in sheets, but I had to use the space as best as I can. So for those of you who haven't come across us before, the Centre for Data Innovation is a Washington-based think tank that works on any kind of public policy issue that we think touches on the ability to use data well. And when I say use it well, I mean that in an economic and in a social sense, and in a political sense. Actually, we've looked at data in politics too. I run the Centre's European practice here in Brussels, and my name is Nick Wallace. And joining me on the panel, I have Leonard Koshvitz from Allied for Startups, I have Jean-Marc Leclerc from IBM, and I have in the middle Piers O'Donoghue from the European Commission. And we're here to discuss the free flow of data. Now, I suspect a lot of you are probably aware that the Commission has very recently published a proposal on the free flow of non-personal data. So we will certainly be discussing that in detail, but I would like the debate to be a little bit broader than that. I don't want to limit the debate to non-personal data because obviously there is a free flow clause in the GDPR, which is worth talking about, and I'd like to get into this distinction between personal and non-personal data. And I also don't only want to talk about data flows inside the European Union, I also want to talk about international data flows too. Now, those of you who've seen how we do panel events before will know that we don't have presentations from everyone because it takes too long and it's not very interesting for a panel debate. We dive straight in with the icebreaker questions, which is what I'm going to do now. I'd like to start with Piers, because you're here representing the Commission and you've been working on this issue for quite some time. So could you kick us off by just explaining what the new proposal says and what the Commission's thinking is, why this has been brought forward?
Sure, thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much. Yes, I think it's important to bring it in context, just as you said, it's not just about the economic effects of data or data flows, but also its social political impact. And that's why this proposal comes in the context. It comes in the wider frame of the Commission's initiative, Commission's policy on the European data economy, where we feel that this is a key element for social and economic development in the future. The Commission set out its thinking at the start of this year. We had already mentioned it in the Digital Single Market proposal or initiative itself. And then we came out with the proposal in September. I'll describe that very briefly, but the work doesn't stop there. We are, as we have announced, working on issues such as access and reuse of data in order to look at the full picture. And of course, when we look at access and reuse, we have to think about what some people and what we ourselves at one stage called ownership, even though that's not a particularly helpful way of defining it. But at least it puts a marker down which we can talk around. But it also does talk more about control and I think most importantly, access and the conditions for access. And this of course relates back to personal data as well as non-personal data. Whereas of course we do have the GDPR, which very clearly already sets particular set of rules for personal data. So the proposal is a short one. I could almost go through article by article, but even that's probably too detailed. Just to say that it has at its core a proposal, a principle, which should be established in European law and therefore effective in all member states, that the member states shall not actually introduce or maintain barriers to data movement. That is to say, they shall not impose localization requirements on data. The one big exception is, as you would expect in any internal market measure, that there can be, for reasons of public security, there can be localization requirements in certain specific areas where data is related to clear public security interests and or threats to public security. Then we have a mechanism to make it work. There's a cooperation mechanism. But just as importantly, in order to have buy-in from the member states, there's a mechanism where we try to reinforce what's already on the ground about making data available. So of course we want a single market for data. We want companies and individuals to be able to choose where and how they store and process their data. But if as a legal person or as a natural person you're subject to for example, a tax requirement in a member state, you need to be able to provide data. Well, that obligation remains on you irrespective of where you store or process the data. And we just want to make it clearer, although there are a lot of mechanisms already in place in different sectors, that needs to be reinforced and confirmed. And then there's a cooperation mechanism between member states. Again, we're trying to fill in the gaps, not create something new, but where those cooperation mechanisms already exist. And lastly, although this is not a legal obligation on anybody in particular except the Commission, we have proposed that the Commission, we ourselves, be mandated by the Council to work with industry so that they can actually develop self-regulatory measures to create greater facility, greater transparency and greater ease of portability of data. So we're setting the legal principles, but we actually want this to work in practice in the market. And that is why we think that because it's such a fast-moving technology, if we were to create rules now and standards that be out of date by the time the regulation was adopted, it's better that we have industry work on this, and of course we can then support that through transparency measures, etc. So that's really the proposal in the package, and as I say, it is in the wider context of developing the European data economy.
Thank you. So I think the next question I wanted to ask, and I should perhaps to give some context to where I'm coming from with this question. You know, we're a think tank that's very enthusiastic about data and particularly about the free flow of data. So that's the kind of background I'm coming from when I ask this question. Why do data localization rules exist at all?
Well, I mean, the glib answer, but I have actually used this from time to time, is you should ask the member states. But yes, we did look at this in some detail, and in many cases we found that they're a hangover from the paper era. So I gave the tax example. In the old days, if you had to produce tax data, well, then it was probably in a filing box in your basement. But also, more importantly for the discussions we're now having, it is in some cases used as a proxy for data security or for ensuring that data, that valuable data not be corrupted, and that in some cases, whether it's company records or registrations or whatever else, that the originals of documents, in this case the data, their validity can be established. And that's the discussions we have with member states. We have a number of what we call structured dialogues, which is basically deep dives with the officials responsible to actually work out these ideas. And of course, the discussion is often about, well, you know, there's an awful lot of technology out there which can be used for good, which can actually help the member states to address exactly those public policy concerns in a way which, as I'm sure many of the tech-aware people here know, is actually safer, gives more security than local filing.
Jean-Marc, I'd like to bring you in here because obviously you represent a very large company that works across countries. Looking at this from the kind of business side, do you think do you have any theories about why some member states might still want to preserve the free flow of data? And in your answer, you can refer to other member states or to member states outside of the Union. I don't want to overlook that distinction.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thanks to the Centre for organizing this event. I guess you meant member states wanting to preserve data localization.
Exactly. Yeah. One moment straight. I'm sorry we don't have enough chairs, although I've got to say I'm delighted to see such a packed room. It's brilliant.
There's one here you can fight for.
There's a chair here you can fight for. I think if you ask one of the receptionists if they can bring some more chairs, there are also some really comfortable looking ones just out here that maybe you can steal when no one's looking. But also just be careful not to block the camera because we'll be putting this up online. Well, I'm sure you prefer that we broadcast the panel and not just the back of somebody's head for the next minute. Sorry, John.
it's good to see that many people.
Yes.
So I think there are several reasons. One's probably laziness. In several member states, especially a few ones who have the majority of data localization requirements, and the regulation asks them to remove these data localization almost immediately. So it's, for some member states, I would guess it's administrative laziness to get rid of those proposals. In some member states, you also have rules that have been adopted, not necessarily by the central government, but at a more local level, especially in federal states. It would be also, I guess, for some of these member states, difficult to impose those new rules on those at the more local level. But to me, this shouldn't be an excuse at all. But the core problem for those member states who still are reluctant to do so, I think, is, to put it simply, a matter of protectionism. Pierce rightly said that a lot of data localization requirements are due to the paper era, but it's also a weapon for some countries to create market access barriers. Because of the data localization requirement, basically tells you, if you're a service provider, that you're not really welcome in that area to do business. And so in some member states, it can be used as a weapon to exclude some companies from entering this market. So I think that's the third, historically, the third reason. But hopefully, this is the main one we have to fight against. Hopefully, thanks to the long structured dialogue that the Commission has had with the member states, hopefully all these more protectionist rules are slowly but surely disappearing, and I believe this is the case if you follow the recent discussions in Council, including this week, an impression that this is disappearing. And if I can just say one word about this process, because this is a proposal that in the industry we've been waiting for quite a while, and I've really supported the Commission in doing so, and I want to take the opportunity to commend the perseverance from Mr. Ansip, Pierce and his teams to really try and get this done. It took a few years, and this process of explaining to the member states what Pierce just talked about, that data localization doesn't provide for better security, will not help you protect privacy rights better, all those proxies, as you've said. So it took a while, but I think the lesson we get from this, that we can maybe use someday for other topics, is that when we talk about smart regulation, maybe this is an example of a smart way to do regulation. Prepare, although it took a couple of years, prepare in advance, discuss extensively with member states in structured dialogues, industry, members of the parliament, so that when you put the proposal on the table, if you manage to do so, then perhaps you will have a shorter time for adoption, which is what we all hope for this one in particular. So the process has been very useful to convince those member states about those wrong reasons why you should have data localization.
Thank you. So this is where I'd like to bring in London, because I suppose it's not hard to imagine why rules on when you could store data would be very frustrating for large companies operating in many countries at the same time. But what I'd like to ask is, obviously you're part of the French Association that represents European startups and small businesses. What impact do data localization rules have specifically on small European startups?
Well, yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for having me here. Allied for Startups is a network, actually, of a global network.
Right.
So we believe startup is a company that thinks globally from day one, and so should the policy context that applies to these companies should be reflected in. And I think looking back a little bit, since the public policy dialogue for startups, but also startups in the public policy dialogue, is something rather new. It's an interesting fact that the free flow of data has been one of the very first wishes that the startup community expressed towards policymakers. Former Commissioner Nelly Kroes has initiated an amazing project with the Startup Manifesto at the time, and I think it was a very short and crisp document. And 1 out of 6 points that were made were for the free flow of data. So on the one hand, we're coming sort of very happy to see sort of the very initial request addressed, and also I think it's important to underline that this is something that comes very naturally to young companies and mostly young entrepreneurs in a space where they grow up already without too visible borders. So often speaking to startups, the question is, what? Sure, we want a free flow of data, but why would there be data borders anyway? Doesn't make any sense, right? If you think about it, and this is where I'm coming to your question. The big advantage of startups, and also the reason for their success, is that over the years and with the technological evolution, the cost of establishing and running a business has extremely dropped. All these tasks that usually the husband or the wife of the entrepreneur has been taking over, being part-time accountant, being part-time IT developer or IT technician, doing the invoicing, setting up a website, setting up a shop, and all these things that had to be done either whilst or before you could actually focus on the actual business idea you had. Today can be easily outsourced. It's a few subscriptions, it's ticking a few boxes, and you have an extremely, let's say, well-oiled machine and a wide choice of different offers at your disposal. So you as an entrepreneur can really focus on what you do best. And well, cloud services and data processing services in the widest sense are an integral part of that. So yeah, to cut it short, the very fact that you can not only choose the best Portuguese data provider and cloud storage provider, but you can actually choose at least amongst those in the EU, or those in the EU is a huge advantage, and yeah, is only fair providing startups the best and the best available and the safest, the most secure, and at the best price services that they need to develop their products.
Could I come in there? I feel it's essential and it's very useful to hear what Leonard's saying, because often it's been said that this proposal, or the reason the Commission is moving, is because we just want to make it easier for big companies. And big companies have heard this as well, they're well able to speak for themselves. Which is slightly cynical, but of course maybe people need to be cynical about some things that happen here. But in reality, it is about small companies and startups. And of course, it's not about small companies and startups in the tech sector. It's across all sectors of the economy. So we do have real examples of startups with great ideas for applications or online services. And they just want to go across one border. But if they're forced to pay for IT services or IT storage of their own in that second market, well, for a startup, that's a prohibitive cost. That actually makes the difference between whether or not there's a business case to launch the service or not. And so it works both ways. The other thing about the data silos, national silos created by data localization, is that, of course, as Jean-Marc said, it might be some form of protectionism, but it is also counterproductive in the sense that even if that were your objective, of course, it is the very large companies who have the economies of scale to be able to, well, I exaggerate, but build a data center tomorrow. So small niche providers of cloud or other services, which might include storage, they are again disfavored. They again lose out by these data localization measures. So I think this, the economy of the startup, the economy of the SME, and across all sectors of the economy are a key motivation for this proposal.
One thing I noticed when I was reading the proposal that I don't think we've mentioned yet, and so I'm not going to assume everybody in the room kind of reads every Commission proposal with gusto, but of course you should. But one thing I noticed was that it only prohibits data localization restrictions inside the European Union. So bear in mind we're talking about non-personal data. We will get onto personal data a little bit later on in the discussion. That it would still be legal for member states to restrict the flow of data outside of the European Union. Is there a rationale for that? Is it because there's a good reason to do that, or is it because the Commission wanted something that would get through Council? I think I should start with Piers.
There's a legal reason and there's a political reason. And the legal reason is that this is an internal market measure. And from a legal point of view of getting through Council, that is actually also the case, because if we were to move a certain other legal basis of the treaty, we may need to get unanimity. But it's because it's an internal market measure, it is fully in line with the digital single market, create one market in Europe. But yes, we did have concerns, and we did have to think about how this would play out, because even if in separating personal data from non-personal data, we were trying to slightly separate the discussions, nevertheless there is an ongoing discussion about personal data, about data in general, and it's data security, and that of course is just as important for non-personal data as well. It is the security of data in certain areas of the world, particularly with regard to governments and administrations who, they have none of the qualms that a European state would have with regard to surveillance or even theft of intellectual property.
Do European states have that many qualms about surveillance?
Well, there I'm not passing the book. There you have to ask them. But certainly, even as Jean-Marc said, we had another discussion on Monday. We had a discussion about public security, and that was sufficient. I don't sense that there was any underhand, as you say, qualms about that. No. It is that we did need to convince the member states that this has to happen. But we do believe that if you do move to what the proposal does allow member states to do, is that in justified areas to impose proportionate, transparent requirements, which might be about security. And of course that can be followed up through enforcement measures, that can also be followed up contractually. So there can be audit in the country, in the member state, to make sure that that is the case. And of course once member states become, as it were, comfortable with that, we believe that we are on the road to having a much more open approach to data flows internationally.
So on this point about data security, I mean, if you'll forgive me for using kind of, well, semi-hypothetical but nonetheless extreme example, what kind of data is more secure? Data stored in plain text on a server in your basement, or data encrypted where you hold the keys, stored on a server in Airstrip 1, for those of you who read 1984. So that definitely doesn't have any qualms about surveillance or scooping up data. Perhaps I should maybe talk to you guys from the kind of tech savvy and the business side. Which in those two examples would be the more secure option?
I'm going with encryption.
You're going with encryption, even if you're sending it to a state that's got really extreme surveillance practices.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a no-brainer.
That's why
that's what we're trying to safeguard and protect encryption. It's a very important one. Can I just say something before we move on to the international data transfers? To stay on this proposal. I think we have to be. I like the Commission's proposal. I think we have to be careful with some little adjustments which could make it useless. Piers mentioned the only exception in the proposal, which is for national security, right? It's public security. You can make your own interpretation of what that would mean, even though we have some quite clear text in the treaties, in the case law, about what that means. I'm still concerned, and I will be until the end, that especially some national governments will try to make a broad interpretation of what that means. We have heard in the past some member states say that, right, public security, that means public safety, that means public health, that means public documents, public interest data. Yeah, you can go very far, you know. So I just want to make the point, because I really hope that if you expand this to more and more exceptions, then in the end, you know, what you have left, you know, you can have more and more data localization and continue with that trend that we've seen in the past few years. So for me, that's a key one. And if I may mention another important article in the regulation, Article 4, where you have this section on the oversight mechanism, the references to the Transparency Directive. You really want to make sure that, because you still have the possibility as a member state to have data localization measures as long as they are justified, etc. And you would have to go through this mechanism from the Transparency Directive. It's a good mechanism for sure. I'm no expert in this mechanism, of course, but from what I understand, I don't feel like the Commission has a real blocking power in this mechanism. I have the impression that the only blocking power is after the fact. If the member state still wants to pass that law or that new rule, which has a data localization measure, then you would start a procedure against the member state. You tell me if I misunderstood
this. Yes, yeah, I didn't give every detail. There's a notification mechanism before the member states. So if they adopt a draft law, they have to notify it. And we have a very simple, boring piece of internal market legislation called the Transparency Directive, which works very well, which is why people don't hear about it much. And that's simply going to reuse that mechanism. And if there's any, whether it's on the size of jam jars or data localization, you have to notify the measure if it isn't in line with EU measures. But at the end of the day, yes, if a member state were to put one in place, unfortunately, yes, but that's the entire single market. Then the Commission has powers to pursue individual cases. The case law itself then creates precedent.
I should say at the centre we do talk about Commission proposals and regulations that we like as well as the ones we don't. The Second Payment Services Directive we think is a very smart piece of legislation. But this has brought me on to what I was kind of your question I was planning to ask anyway, is that data localization rules, whatever their motivation, and it may indeed be some notion of data security, they're not always legal. When I say legal, when I say not always legal, I don't mean that they're illegal. I mean that they're not always in legislation. They're often buried in procurement rules, especially if you're thinking about public sector procurement and tendering, and you know, they get forced into public sector contracts and this kind of thing. And this is where we can bring in both kind of non-personal and personal data at the same time. How effective will the free flow of data regulation and the GDPR be at stopping that level of data localization, which is much harder to track, I think, at union level? Anyone who wants to jump in on that is first come, first served there, I think.
Well, I think it's the aspect you're pointing to is absolutely crucial, because what you're saying is there's a lot going on which is not sort of in the tier 1 area, but it's a bit further buried. And I think also an important part that was highlighted in the impact assessment by the Commission, that sometimes there might do not actual data localization measures exist, but there's a strong perception that, oh yeah, this is a tricky piece of data, there must be some special requirements around there. And I think this is also an extremely strong effect that the regulation can have, that we get more clarity in that space. That we raise the awareness not only for users or you know, service providers, but also for those in public service and administration, that this is something that we want to adhere to. So I think if it's not sort of the hangover one from the paper area, or the protectionism, or the hangover two, which is sort of the short-term gains that member states, some of the larger member states, might expect when offering national clouds, right? Then I think sort of the awareness raising.
As to run, you mean?
Yeah. And sort of the awareness and the clarity, the clarifying effect of the regulation is not to underestimate.
I think it's right to point to the impact assessment. We had real problems in building an economic case to justify the proposal, because so much of what is data localization is buried in that way, and people would smirk at us when we said that we only had 50 or so cases, examples in primary law of data localization. It was the tip of the iceberg, and that iceberg often was administrative practices. Actually, one of the interesting things is that you know, our text is good, but there may even be improvements to the text, because there has been a discussion in Council about having to actually pinpoint administrative practices as well as rules of law, which would get specifically to public procurement. But the other virtue of having this as a legal principle is that it's not too prescriptive, but it does create the clarity and transparency. It creates the certainty that Leonard was talking about, simply that both those who are offering services, but the procurers themselves, working for local government, for example, it can be very clear, no, there is no data localization requirement. I shouldn't and I don't have to give preference to somebody who offers a service and they're going to store the data down the road. That should be done.
Would it be legally possible for somebody who is looking at a call for tender in in OJEU or something like that, and who sees a mention of data localization requirement, would they be able to raise a complaint at EU level?
Yes, actually they could do so already if they felt that it was impinging on the freedom to provide services or the freedom of establishment. They could already take the case.
I'm glad you bring this issue of administrative practices and public procurement in the discussion. This has been a very important point for us. I see that the council discussions of this week are discussing this point, that there is a proposal to have in the definition of what is a data draft act or data localization definition of those administrative practices. I see that the presidency mentions that public procurement should be understood as an administrative practice, which is great. I'd be even happier if public procurement could, in those words, could be added inside the text of the regulation. I think that would make it even clearer if that's at all possible, because I know that the Commission had issues with this specific point, but I'd love to see the Council go even further and really put it black on white in there.
It has to be said, there's another discussion which is a bit more worrying, and which is going to fold back into this one, which is that there are one or two member states who actually want to create exceptions for public sector data, administrative data, etc. And not just the idea, but the scope of that could be very worrying. It could remove some of the sense from the proposal. And of course then, Nick, you said at the start, we have to put this in the wider context of data policy and what we're doing. And as we are pushing, as we're investing in big data analytics, in the use of metadata for public policy goals in smart cities, in improving services for the public, etc., etc. This is completely going the opposite direction, and it's something that needs to be challenged, and I hope that the groups and associations and individuals represented here will be aware and alive to that issue as the negotiations go on.
And I should say to you, just because there's so many of you here and there's some of you real stalwarts who are standing at the back through this whole thing, I'll try and find time to talk to all of you afterwards, especially those of you who are standing up for the session. The next point that I wanted to get onto was actually something that Piers touched on earlier, was this fact that we'll have two separate regulations for personal and non-personal data when it comes to the flow of data. And here I'm thinking particularly about flows outside of the Union, whereas in the GDPR you have a general prohibition on the flow of data outside of the EU, but you also have a framework that sets out how data can leave the EU. So you can have the binding contractual agreements, you can have the bilateral agreements, you can have the adequacy decisions. So this is how you have things like privacy shield and adequacy decisions for countries like Canada, for example, this kind of thing. With non-personal data, the free flow of data regulation, although I would encourage Piers to correct me if I get this wrong, you won't have anything like that. There won't be a union-level framework for flows outside of the EU. So in other words, you're probably going to have different rules in different member states. So you have a common set of rules for GDPR, for personal data, and a fragmented set of rules for non-personal data. So my question here, I think, is, actually I have two questions coming from this. And the first one is how, and this is probably more of a kind of a question to the industry guys, is how difficult is it to separate, actually no, it's a policy question too. How difficult is it to separate and to define personal and non-personal data to ensure that you're complying with these two different sets of law when you're transferring data outside of the EU? And the second thing is kind of a more sort of a question on just in terms of European integration, is does that give license to individual member states to create trade barriers by blocking the flow of non-personal data, whereas they can, they wouldn't have the power to block the flows of personal data? Do those two questions make sense? So yeah, anyone on the panel wants to jump in first and attempt to answer?
So I'll try to give the superficial answer, and I'll leave it to Jean-Marc to go into the expert details. I think looking back to what I said in the beginning, our interest is really that these policies reflect global reality for not only digital companies but any company that has the potential to go global with the technology at hand. And obviously there is, if we speak about data barriers or localization measures in a global context, there's some entirely different examples. There's, China and Russia and Vietnam are mentioned in that extension. So obviously there should also be an aspiration from the European Union taking, let's say, playing a certain role model on a global policy scale, that this is not sort of the comparison that should come to mind. So I think thinking in the longer term, we would definitely like to see anything that helps to secure a free flow of data globally. But also then I mentioned a few of those agreements that are in place today. I think the very key aspect for a small and fast-growing company is a simple and clear rule set. Provide legal clarity in a way that enables the smallest provider to be compliant as conveniently as possible. That would sort of be the higher level thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with this, and you talk about the distinction between personal and non-personal form. We have, you know, an exhaustive definition in the GDPR of what is personal data. Personally, I always thought that non-personal data is everything else, and that's it. You know, if you start defining what non-personal data is, I am worried that you're going to restrict what it actually is. So for me, the broader, the better. So I would say anything that's not personal data as defined by the GDPR, to put it very simply. On the issue of third countries and data flows between the EU and other countries, yeah, we have enormous problems of data localization outside of the EU. Then I've mentioned some countries. I don't want to point the finger at specific countries, but there are many more everywhere. What we're interested in is, of course, the adequacy decisions that the Commission has put in place. We have the never-ending story of the privacy shield, and I really hope that this mechanism, which we think, of course, can always be improved, but has to be safeguarded absolutely. Or you remember that period between the court decision and the privacy shield, the adoption, the uncertainty was enormous, and all those cases at the moment are bringing a lot of concern. So the adequacy decisions are a good mechanism. What we're interested in is transfer mechanisms from third countries to the EU. You know, we want to store, process data from non-EU countries in the EU. And you know, that's what really matters. We'd really like to see. I know it's a tricky topic. We'd love to see mechanisms that can facilitate this. And there's a lot of discussions. You probably followed the debates in the Parliament last week on digital trade. This is a key issue. But I focus more on movements of data, non-personal data from third countries to the EU. I think that's an easier debate than in the opposite direction.
Could I just say that yes, the GDPR, first of all, it's a free movement measure. It's an internal market measure, and that's why it states that member states can't impose extra rules, can't impose restrictions on non-personal data as long as the data is protected in accordance with the GDPR. But to look at it from and that's why we have now, this proposal is on non-personal data to complete that. Jean-Marc said exactly what is the thinking of the Commission. We have a very clear, maybe sometimes very precise definition of what is personal data. If we were to try to define non-personal data, well, then we're inevitably going to get it wrong. There will be an overlap or a gap somewhere. So that it is everything else has been criticised and cancelled, but we're very comfortable that that is the best way of dealing with this. Particularly as technology changes, we have provisions about anonymization in the GDPR, so that the actual meaning of the definition is going to shift as whether it's quantum or high performance computing shifts the ground as to when you can reconstitute personal data. So we have to be forward looking. But on the data flows, and I know you've been trying to get this for a while, Nick, to the international data flows. It is the case that we needed to particularly preserve the protection given by the GDPR, so hence the adequacy agreements for the contract clauses or the binding corporate rules. But now let's just step back for a moment. On non-personal data, it's not as if there is nothing happening. It's not as if everything stops at the frontiers of the European Union. Of course, there's fragmentation and there are problems, particularly when a company is trying to think global. We're having a couple of couple of countries where you do business in Europe and a couple outside of Europe. And what I would say is, of course, we're not positively contributing to improve that situation, but we're not making it any worse. And again, it's a question of member states having to become more comfortable, particularly with non-personal data, that if they do impose security requirements data controller can show that this non-personal data is being stored in accordance with those data requirements somewhere in the world, well then they should be happy. Otherwise, we're probably talking about data which anyway falls back into the first public security definition in the first place. Otherwise, why would they want to impose restrictions? Why would they hamper their own companies from having this global business?
I mean, the second part, I think we've already discussed, that we know that they might well want to do that even if it isn't necessarily a national security requirement, and for a non-EU data flow they could do that. I mean, I think what I was trying to think about was just if you're a business, small or large, there would be this kind of, I don't want to use the word absurd because maybe that's a bit too strong, but this situation where it would be completely legal to store your customers' credit card details on a server in Canada. Anywhere in the EU, once GDPR comes in, that will be, I mean, it's already legal actually under the Data Protection Directive, but if you're in a member state that's decided that it doesn't trust Canadian data centers for whatever reason, you would not be able to store other kinds of non-personal machine data on a data center in Canada. And I would have thought that from the point of view of most European citizens, the personal data is the more sensitive kind. I mean, this is what I was driving at, was simply that there would be it would be possible for member states to restrict activity in that way, in a way that they cannot with personal data.
Yeah, but first of all, that's the situation now. So if that scenario exists, it exists now, and as I say, we're not necessarily contributing to overcoming it. But
I wasn't suggesting the Commission was making it.
Canada is also a bad example because we now have a trade agreement with Canada.
Okay, yeah, that's true.
And actually, that's the point.
Argentina has an adequate decision.
There, the adequacy, mapping the adequacy decisions is actually interesting to see how the trade flows. Now, a separate discussion with Japan to the free trade agreement that just recently been concluded. But what is important is that, again, the member states will learn, but it is also the free trade agreements, it's a positive weapon for change, in the sense that the European Union is busily trying to develop stronger trade arrangements with like-minded countries, and that should hopefully rapidly expand. In some cases, it is the adequacy agreement, which is the personal data that will become the issue. But we have to also put a focus on this by removing the barriers within the European Union. We're not, unless we do that, and until we do that, we're not in a position to lecture others, and we're not in a position to point out to individual member states what you have called like the absurdity, or what would be a rather strange position for their lives.
Although, as you've mentioned, this proposal, remains in the scope of union law. This is a signal, and we've discussed this many times in the past 2 years. This is a signal to the rest of the world, really, and something I believe, if adopted in its current form, can be used by the Commission. Hopefully, the member states, especially those who have pushed for this, when negotiating with some countries, some of them you mentioned, say we've done this here. We believe that is good for the data economy, for the digital economy, for the entire economy. We would like you to do the same. So in trade agreements, I think this will be a very useful weapon for the European Union to have, really.
I mean, if there's any of you here thinking that I'm asking unduly harsh questions, it was basically a pretty good proposal for legislation. It's my job to do that. That's why I'm a policy analyst. Do you think that, I mean, I'm aware that at the moment the EU's position on trade is that it doesn't discuss personal data as part of trade agreements, so it doesn't discuss privacy matters. And I understand this, but do you think we could get to a position, or are we moving towards a position, and this I'm kind of teasing out from what Piers just said, where we would be able to use trade agreements to support a freer flow of international data, and which accounts for differences in privacy legislation, which I think will remain. I mean, if you think about transatlantic flows, for example, and most of the companies that are likely to be moving data are legally answerable inside the European Union anyway. You know, they have offices here that can be sued if they breach European law. Is there a way that kind of trade negotiations can support a freer flow of both personal and non-personal data, or are we still, is there still kind of a roadblock there?
Well, if you follow the discussions with Japan, for example, that Pierce has mentioned, you see that there's a request from third countries to have provisions on data flows, because digital trade is data flows, mostly, you know. So it's not just a call from some stakeholders based here in Europe, but, you know, on the other side of the Pacific, Atlantic, wherever you want, there are calls for this to happen. So I think it's taking a lot of time, but it cannot not happen, or else we will be here completely isolated, and nobody's going to want to trade with us. If we continue to put such barriers, and as Pierce mentioned, we need to have some consistency and some coherence. We can't, on the one hand, put this on the table, and on the other hand, not do the same at a global level. It's just incoherent if you understand the digital economy as something that's by nature global. I know we have specific views on, you mentioned privacy, other issues, but it shouldn't always be an obstacle to making at least some progress in other international data transfers.
No, let's be clear, the Commission is actively advocating freer and better international data flows. So as well as individual free trade agreements that are being discussed, there's also discussions going on what will become sort of a standard clause with regard to a standard set of clauses with regard to data in multilateral trade agreements as well, to ensure that this becomes part and parcel. Oh, I mean, Vice President Ansip has been very clear about it, Commissioner Malmström has been very clear about it, that it is Commission objective to actually have a framework of data for the good of Europe in the world, but actually for the good of other areas, in order for us to properly fulfill our responsibilities in supporting the development goals, the UN development goals, then it is clear that we need to have better international data flows.
I want to come back to Lenny, because I appreciate LFS Startups as a global alliance, but you represent the European bit of it, you need the European bit of it. Jean-Marc mentioned this kind of issue that if we don't move forward on the flow of data, then people will become more reluctant to trade with us. What does data localization on one hand, or the free flow of data on the other hand, mean for the competitiveness of of European businesses generally, and also the ability of European tech startups, because for the moment European tech companies generally are much smaller than non-European tech companies, and this is an area where obviously this is part of the Commission's digital signature strategy, is trying to build a stronger European tech economy. What impact does it have on the ability of European tech startups to grow and to compete with competitors in, say, the US and China?
Well, yeah, a very, very good point, and I think here is it's actually a very, very interesting and exciting question in a larger policy context, because I think startups may be the first peers that policymakers are dealing with that are not naturally bound to a country or an economy anymore. And this is actually something President Macron said. And he said, today entrepreneurs are not naturally bound to a country anymore, but they do make a very rational choice on where the establishment of their company is most likely to succeed. And this is a very interesting aspect that we see also evolving within the European Union actually. So just I think a week ago or so in Helsinki at the Slush conference, the State of European Tech was published. It's an amazing report giving, I think, the most comprehensive overview of how entrepreneurs feel across Europe. And a very interesting stat that I've come across there was regarding the mobility of tech talent, but also the growth of tech talent in the different member states. And the Netherlands have done a great job climbing up the ranks, and I think they have, after Ireland, the second biggest growth in tech talent in their in their country right now. And my assumption is that this coincides with a declaration they made last year with when they introduced a startup visa, and they boldly stated, let's make the Netherlands the best country in Europe to found a tech company, a tech startup. And I think so the conclusion we're drawing from this, that there is definitely a regulatory competition, not only within the union, but obviously globally. And that this is something that perhaps startups are the first companies, or perhaps more modestly expressed, this is a crucial difference from what the EU has understood to be a small and medium enterprise and a startup. That there is no preset location, and that there is a very rational choice on finding the best way to establish your company. And as Piers mentioned previously, cost of storing and processing data can be prohibitive in certain senses. So I would definitely see this as one of the key decision criteria for a company on where to establish. So yeah, this is something that can happen very early stage if the means are there, but obviously can also happen during the life cycle of a startup company, that when you stand in front of a big investment, a relocation is brought into the discussion. And although entrepreneurs, and let me assure you of that, do feel really European in their hearts, at the end of the day, sort of the choice is made on a rational basis. So yeah, there can be very immediate and very absolute effects to that.
Before I open up to questions from the audience, I wanted to just kind of throw out a final wildcard question that actually some of my colleagues in the States have been looking at, which is the Supreme Court case of Microsoft's data centers in Ireland. It seems to us that whatever outcome of that case, whether they win or lose, it's bad for the free flow of data. Because if Microsoft loses the case, then the message that goes out is, well, don't give your data to American companies anymore, and demand that it be stored in the EU. And if they win the case, then it may not be quite so damaging for for American companies in particular, but there would still be a strengthening of demand for storing data in the EU, because they would have won by putting their data in Ireland. And this is also kind of showing that it's not all coming from the European side, this push for data localization. It is a more complex international problem. This just seems to be a really interesting dilemma when you look at it from that angle. So I just wanted to invite anyone from the panel, if they wanted to comment on that, to see if there's maybe a third way that I haven't spotted.
Well, yeah, and you're right, there is a link with this regulation. Access by authorities, whichever can be, but in the context of this case, this industry is always advocated for solutions at international level, treaties that everybody can know about wherever you are, as the most simple way and clear way to deal with those exchanges of data or access to data between in this regulation, you have an article on access to by public authorities to data for regulatory purposes, right? As Piers mentioned, tax authorities want to check, that's their job. And if you have that data in another country, then you should have access to it as the public authority. Of course, who's going to be against that? Obviously, we don't want that to be broadened to more. And I believe there have been some discussions about this as well with the council, and my impression is that it seems to be understood that it shouldn't be broadened for other reasons beyond access for regulatory control. But we'll see what happens with this Microsoft case. You're right to say that the consequences could be huge because
whichever way the wind goes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's difficult to. I don't have a crystal ball and tell you what the reactions on the market from other countries will be. But let me say this: it's not just a problem with American authorities wanting access from Microsoft customers that are installed in Europe. There are many other countries where this is happening. We have legislation having been adopted or in the course of being adopted in Europe, which can lead to governments accessing data without having to ask anybody for their consent, or so it's beyond this case really. I know it will be useful for other jurisdictions to know what happens there, but it's much broader than this one Microsoft case, I think.
It's very hard to count because whatever about crystal balls, I mean, it's been at the New York Federal Court, then the Appeal Court, and now the Supreme Court, and it's gone backwards and forwards. But it will have an effect in the sense that first of all, it's so hard to explain. Very hard to understand because at heart we're talking about law enforcement agency looking for data about a suspected criminal, which is the sort of public policy activity that one would expect, and that is already the case dealt with in cooperation agreements, for example, between European police authorities and European judicial authorities. So it's a point of law, but a significant one as to why is the United States not using the judicial cooperation agreement in order to have access to that data rather than instructing.
Ireland has courts too.
Yes, Ireland has courts too. I'm an Irishman, so I can confirm that some very good lawyers as well. It's that choice. So it's an intra-US argument which is going to have some fallout, I suspect. But given that we're talking about data that is stored in Ireland, if it has repercussions on this discussion, well then it would be very hard to manage that. But it could also have an impact on how corporations who are very active in the European market and providing vital service alongside European homegrown companies. So that it could also cause some unfortunate discussions there, which aren't going to have one thing, which goes back to why we're doing this, and everything that we do in the digital single market and DG Connect is that we are trying to encourage and promote the take-up of these ICT technologies and services by everybody, by every sector of the economy and society, because of the benefits that brings. And anything which undermines that is actually preventing us from having the social and economic benefits that we see can arise.
Okay, so we're just coming up to 10:05. So the time remaining, with such a big audience, crammed into such a small room, I want to open up for questions. I know actually Peter's hand went up a while ago, so please.
Thanks, good morning. My name is Guido Brano. I'm from ITI, the Information Technology Industry Council, and we represent global technology companies. And I had a question in relation to the public security exception, which in the discussion reminds me a lot of the Services Directive a few years ago. The Services Directive was of 2009, 9 years after we were still discussing how actually to enforce it properly. And there's a mechanism which is similar to what is now in the proposal. One good thing of the Services Directive was that there was a peer review process, so member states would have to come together once the directive was in place and discuss potential ways to enforce it, potential exceptions, etc. So my question is, would that mechanism help finding out when there is actually a real valid public security exception? Because I recognize the complexity of detailing in the proposal, in the law itself, what cases are justified and what not. That might actually also be a more efficient way than just go one infringement proceeding after the other behind those countries that don't enforce the rules properly. And an additional benefit of that might be that then the EU has a very useful body of data to discuss with third countries in the global context when you actually can have exceptions to free flow of data internationally or not, based on their discussions within member states. Is that kind of discussion potentially taking place in Council now?
First of all, your reference to the Services Directive, we could arguably say that had discussions in 2009 gone differently, we may not have to have had a free flow of data proposal if it would be much clearer about not just the provision of services, but self-provision of services by a startup with regard to IT. If that had been more clearly covered, we wouldn't have to be here. But I understand your question. We didn't go into details on these mechanisms because we wanted to keep it light, but we also wanted to reuse existing mechanisms. So we do actually make reference to the Services Directive. For example, the notification mechanism, although our preferred vehicle is the Transparency Directive, simply because it's the one that the member states are most used to using. But underlying that, yes, we did say it was hidden away in the memorandum introducing the proposal that we would create an expert group, which will be of member states, where we wish to have these kind of discussions. Because we have a notification mechanism, we can have that. Is this or not? Or is a security measure, if you're imposing a certain security standard on a given set of data, does that actually state of the art? Does that correspond to the security risk? Is it practical, etc.? So those discussions will take place. But also we have a relatively rapid first review time written into the last article in order to, once we have some examples under our belts, to actually again discuss with member states to speed up the process. Hopefully we won't be having many infringement proceedings. We hope that simply through discussion of the notified procedure that, I give an example which is self-serving because I invented it, but it did actually exist, which is a member state that effectively restricts almost all data from the energy sector. The question is why, and the impact on people who are doing very good things about big data analytics on power use and energy consumption. That's a real pity. So I don't understand that, but if the member state were to say, actually we'll drill down, what we don't want is we don't want the plans of our nuclear power stations to fall into irrelevant hands. Well, okay, so that's a reasonable proposition, no discussion. So it's in many cases we'll be looking for granularity, and that's what the notification mechanism will give us.
Got two questions here. The lady in the top. Please.
Sorry. Hi, I'm the head of the Knowledge Verification team. I have a question regarding the data portability provision and what is the role of the Commission on the companies coming up with self-regulation, or is going to encourage the companies to come up with self-regulatory measures?
Well, we have some experience already, for example, in data protection. We have a code of conduct. In fact, we now have 2 codes of conduct from groups of industry on personal data protection under the GDPR, using that mechanism. But it's self-regulatory in the sense that we want them to come up with codes of conduct or equally effective measures where they control what's in, therefore they can be more informed and hopefully rapid, because one thing about businesses, they say that they're much quicker than us bureaucrats, which is great. So that they will quickly come up with what would be understandable rules which we would then support. We wouldn't necessarily ratify them, but we would support them. Because the purpose, the objective is to give transparency and facility to the user, including at the time when you sign a contract with the cloud service provider, that you know what the exit conditions from the commercial contract point of view, of course, but also from a technical point of view. that's the really crucial thing. To give effect to the free movement of data, an individual or company may decide, well, I want to change provider, or I want to change operating system. What are the APIs? What are the technical standards? What is the time? What is the cost of transferring that and making that data if you want to do so? And that's what we hope to get out of it. But thank you for the question. We didn't agree earlier on, but I can announce now that the first meeting of our cloud stakeholder platform is next week, the 12th of December here in Brussels. We are trying to open that. Anybody who's interested should go onto our website. It will not just discuss this issue, but we will be kicking off the discussions on what self-regulatory measures can we envisage and
Gentleman in the blue tie.
Yeah, I'm Joachim from the Danish Perm Rep. Let me first say thanks for putting the very important topic on the agenda, and thanks to the panelists. I have a question regarding the relation between GDPR and the free flow proposal at hand. More specifically, it relates to mixed data sets. A lot of companies or also member states worry what we'll do to a data set if it both contains personal data and non-personal data, and how would companies handle such data sets in order to comply with both the GDPR and the free flow regulation? Would it be very burdenful in such sense?
Well, I think you would assume. I think you always have different requirements according to different data sets. So if you assume that the GDPR gives the data subject specific rights, either to be informed, to be to have data corrected, to have data stored only for a certain time period and not longer, and so on. So I think in principle you would like the data set to be managed in a way that you can also manage it internally, that it's not sort of one block or one box. But having said that, it is, I think, still what we're looking for here is consistency, that you would not be forced to store these actually separately. You should be able to manage that within the same set, to have different criteria for different types of the data within that set. But it's not a cloud provider for personal data and another one for non-personal data. This is what we would like to avoid at all, if possible.
Yeah, I would share that point of view. It's true that it does cost time and money sometimes to unbundle, especially if you have different rules for different types of data sets. And exactly like Leonard said, the rules should be very clear and understand that it can be difficult on the market to do that. What we would like is that this regulation still makes sense, because you have the GDPR, but this is a simple piece of regulation, right? Especially compared to the GDPR, where you have some very detailed rules. If you have a data set which combines personal and non-personal data, I guess as a company you will be likely to look first at the GDPR and that's it, and then what does it make of this one? Is it useful? I don't know. I'm wondering the same thing as you actually. It's still not clear to me. I see that there were discussions in council on this, and that offered the solution that okay, in a mixed data set, what's personal GDPR applies, what's non-personal free flow of data applies. Okay, but I'm not sure if this answers the question.
No, we can be clearer than that. If in the worst case scenario there is a mixed data set and it is not possible or simply it's too expensive to differentiate, well then the rules of the GDPR have to apply. If there's personal data in there, you have to protect the data set unless you can extract it. But increasingly we feel, because of technology itself, because of the services that are available, in the way that Leonard was talking about, is that will certainly, in a number of cases for companies and individuals, will make to physical security requirements. But increasingly it is possible through software-defined processes to logically differentiate the data immediately in terms of its treatment, even if it is in one place. So not having everything in one box is not desirable, but if it is in one storage environment, it should nevertheless very quickly and cheaply be possible to differentiate at all other levels. But the physical security would be the place, if you are storing it on one server in one place, well then the GDPR applies anyway.
Good morning, I'm James Thompson from Cullen International. On the public security exception, what is the difference between public security and national security? National security is not covered by EU law, it's sole responsibility of member states. So the Commission didn't use specifically use public security in the proposal. So can you say anything about the difference between the two?
Well, you've given the core of the answer. Is national security is already excluded from any internal measure. Say the member state is free to do whatever it likes in regards to national security. That's actually why I corrected Jean-Marcus, because that relates to issues such as defence, military issues and so on, which are excluded from the treaty. A treaty measure cannot impose obligations on member states if it impinges on national security. Public security would include a number of other things. We may actually find ourselves being a bit more explicit and explanatory in the recitals and the work that we're doing with the Estonian presidency at the moment. Some examples would be in terms of police matters, criminal investigations, but also security in terms of terrorism. And there could be emergency situations, for example, say in relation to a very serious food poisoning or outbreak of a serious infection through, say, the food chain, for example, where data which is normally relatively insensitive it needs to be locked in because there is urgent examination needs to be done to find the source. But we are still actually trying to list some of those examples. And the lazy way, I hope I've been now precise, or at least clear as what we're going, the lazy way of answering the question is always then just to say, well, it's the Court of Justice that tells us what public security is. But it's not too lazy, because we do actually have some examples already where in the past member states have invoked public security, and the court has said actually that's too much, it's not precisely.
This would apply with things like energy data, which I think that's the argument that the French government uses.
Yes, I mean, there is a real discussion that needs to take place about energy security. I gave sort of a very obvious and probably therefore too obvious example of the nuclear power station, but energy security in some cases, which even in our very recent history in Europe has been something that has been very, very sensitive on geopolitical level. So that is something which we're unlikely to come down and say it is or is not, but that's why the notification mechanism comes in again why it's so important. That member states will have genuine reasons, acting in good faith, where actually they need to do this, and they will be able to come and explain it to us.
Well, would it be possible that such a notification procedure and in a specification of a national measure? I'm taking the example. I mean, obviously, it might be understood that protecting nuclear plants is absolutely justified, but speaking of the energy sector in general, might be too broad. So, would it be possible that the Commission comes back with an answer like that?
Yeah, that's how the Transparency Directive works. Mm-hmm. It isn't always a yes, no, or binary proposal. It is, could you please explain why you have prescripted this, or you are preventing the movement of a certain good or a certain service? And there is a give and take. And in some cases, we understand better what the member state wants to achieve, and in some cases, we help the member state to actually be more precise about what it is that they need to address.
I think I saw a hand at the back here.
No. Did I see your hand go up? Or? Okay, I'm sorry. No.
Perhaps I can ask a follow-up question on the transparency. How does it apply to existing measures? Is there a certain attention to reviewing existing, or is that just not?
No, there is a specific provision in the proposal with regard to existing measures, where the member states have a fixed amount of time within which they must notify us as to whether they are retaining it, withdrawing it, or amending it, and the same process then. But that's explicitly addressed.
Anything else? Because in that case, it means I get to ask a self-serving question that goes back to my research. Good. Because one other question I have, and this is more of a kind of a, I think, an after-dinner question, even though it's 10 in the morning. This is an idea that I developed when I was writing a response to the DSM midterm review. That it seems to me that the Commission has the very unenviable task of trying to build a single market through secondary legislation. Which generally, when you look at single markets, that's not how you do it. The United States has a Commerce Clause. The single market is a matter of the Constitution, and if states interfere with that, they get into trouble. Obviously, the treaties don't have anything like that because the member states don't allow it. So it's like we're kind of building in these measures, one regulation at a time, subject to whittle down by member states in some cases. In other words, it's not really ever close to union. In fact, sometimes it's more like a politically expedient alternative to it. Is there anything, and I'm kind of assuming the answer is probably no, but is there anything in the treaties already that would that could be used or interpreted perhaps in courts in different ways that would free up some of these roadblocks that we have already, like data flows, for example? I'm assuming the answer is no, because you probably would have tried that already.
There are. It's the treaty itself. I have already referred to the provisions on freedom to provide services and freedom of establishment. We took a decision, and we had a long internal discussion before we came out with the proposal. And it was a toss-up at one point as to whether or not we would actually start taking infringement proceedings, and it goes back to a question I was asked earlier, on the basis of the treaty. And we are sure that there's a couple of cases that we could have won, but that would have been what it is. It would have been a full-length, beginning-to-end infringement proceeding. There were some young people in the room. They would be getting quite old. And it can never give rise to the sort of legal clarity that we wanted. Secondly, therefore, in seeking to achieve legal clarity, we also wanted to have the principle established and not to micro-regulate, because the market is going to change, the technology is changing all the time. So if we stay at the level of principles, then we are much safer and much more likely to be able to provide something useful to European economy and society without creating problems down the road. And that's my third point, and I must actually react to what you said more generally about sort of there being something other than agricultural union. First of all, the digital single market is largely about removing obstacles. And whether it's the paper era localization rule for data flows, or national television markets and copyright and cable and satellite access rules, and so on, it's just that we are having to modernize our entire regulatory framework to take account of the digital era, because it is disruptive. And that's, of course, positive. It is changing a lot of what we do. So I myself said about the Services Directive, when the proposal came out, I think it was two years earlier, 2007, we had known in 2006 where we would be today, but perhaps we would have taken a different approach. But of course that wasn't the case. We couldn't have foreseen how data technologies, online services would have just completely disrupted the market and given rise to the sort of mentality that is now embedded in all startups. They are not wedded to one location, they're wedded to the best place to do their business. So I'll stop there, but the final point is that we are in what is now a large number of legislative proposals the system is creaking a bit because of the number of things that we're trying to do. But in each of those measures, we are trying to be operate at the level of principles and also to be forward-looking, technology neutral and forward-looking, so that they will be adapted and we won't have to keep reviewing and adapting.
So I think what you're saying is the kind of the volume of stuff that seems to come through at the moment is a temporary situation.
It is. Absolutely, we hope so. Otherwise, the very thing we're trying to create, which is stability and certainty, is not going to exist for the type of companies that we really want to see grow and prosper in our community.
Okay, there's a hand up right at the back.
Charlotte Lozak from Caterpillar. I just have a question. I saw that in the protocol.
Could you speak a little bit?
Sorry, it's Charlotte Lozak from Caterpillar. I saw that in the 2018 program of the Commission, there was a topic which is compliance. And could you elaborate a little bit more about this compliance package? Is the idea already to see if member states are applying new rules about the digital single market? And I mean, if you could provide your perspective on this? Thank you.
Well, I have relatively little information, so I don't have a proper perspective. But one of the 10 priorities of the Juncker Commission was that we ensure that we do less but we do it better. Just given the exception of the DSM, hopefully that will result in less legislation in the future. But it is that doing so would be not just always thinking of new ideas, but seeing are the current rules effective, and then seeing if we have proper implementation of what is already there. And so as the Commission comes towards the end of its term of office, we have another 2 full years, but as the political cycle wraps around to preparations for the next European Parliament elections, it is in any case inevitable that the Commission will be making fewer proposals. That's something which we've clearly stated. The Commission work programme that you just mentioned made it very clear that any important legislation should really be on the table by June of next year at the very latest. So we will then spend the time that is available to us less focused on legislation, more focused then on implementation.
I have a question on the outlaws and the issue of sporting of data in cloud services. Did it pave the way to tougher regulation in the future, because it's mainly about soft law for the moment? And do you think that there is a need for a sector-by-sector regulation, an initiative of the agricultural sector, the transport sector, etc., etc.? Or do you think industry-led initiatives are sufficient for the business?
I'm a bit surprised by your second question. So firstly, there is always the technical possibility of the Commission deciding at a later date that we might need to make proposals. But at the moment we decide is what we really want is the industry to come together and to develop sort of industry design measures where we then can see, do they actually see the user needs? Is there the transparency and certainty that users should expect from a functioning market? And without prejudice to future decisions. We're not putting a gun to anyone's head, and we are fair therefore to say whatever. But the Commission will review progress. This is something that was stated in the regulation. We will review progress in the development. The sector-by-sector approach, no, I would hope not. I would hope that we would not be, certainly in legislation, regulating sector-by-sector. That would contradict what I've just been saying about simplification. So I'm a bit surprised. Maybe there's a reason why you asked me that. I'm not understanding.
No, because in agriculture, for example, we have issues where if you store your data, if you're client of John Deere or Yara, for example, you cannot port your data to other suppliers of agricultural services, maybe you need to have a specific regulation for the agricultural sector, for example.
Okay, well, then sorry, I beg your pardon. I should have been able to think that through for myself, but thank you for the explanation. No, we are addressing this issue in the platforms initiative, which is clearly where we do feel we need to start with that. And that, of course, does implicitly contain a portability element as well. So we will be looking at that. But again, I think we would try to avoid a sectoral approach, because whether you are in the agri-food business or an farmer having to deal with a platform there, or whether you're a small steel manufacturer and you're having to deal with one of the steel industrial platforms, same for car components, etc. We hope that the same principles will apply, and we can actually, if we have to legislate, and that is not decided, if we have to, at least we can have, say, if we were to issue guidance, for example, or if there are self-regulatory measures, they could apply horizontally.
Stevie Joseph from the Association for Financial Markets in Europe. I would like to ask a question in the context of Brexit, if I may. So, as you know, restrictions on the sharing of personal data between the EU27 and the UK could seriously disrupt their ability to continue to transfer personal data post-Brexit. And for global businesses operating on a cross-border basis, this could pose serious challenges. Some think that the best way to provide legal certainty could be for mutual adequacy decisions to be made by the EU27 and the UK. So my question to you is, how feasible do you think this is, and also to be made in time before the UK's withdrawal from the EU and in light of the current state of the negotiations? Thank you.
To me, I have no idea. We don't know what the outcome of the negotiations will be, but as we know already from the 11 or 13 adequacy agreements that existed, of course, they are possible and that they do work. So obviously that possibility exists.
I can venture an answer. I'm a British citizen living in Brussels, so I have a personal stake in some of this, but also because I'm working for a data policy think tank. I've been looking at this too. It seems to me that the British strategy is to implement GDPR to minimise regulatory difference on privacy law, which would lend itself to mutual adequacy decisions, but there is a pretty big fly in the ointment in that strategy, which is the UK's Investigatory Powers Act, which still has a European Court of Justice ruling against it. And I'm not seeing any signs that Britain is going to reform that act. And of course, as we've talked about Canada, we've talked about Argentina, we've talked about Japan. You don't have to have the GDPR to get an adequacy decision. You have to have a comprehensive data protection law that's in one place that the Commission can go and read. But it doesn't have to be the GDPR. And certainly in the Canadian and Japanese cases, it's a very different piece of law. So I wouldn't assume that we're going to have that Britain's going to get this mutual adequacy thing, because they seem to be focusing on privacy law and not looking at surveillance law, which I think is probably a bigger problem. And there's also the broader question of how long the ECJ will have jurisdiction in the UK, and how long European citizens living in the UK will be allowed to make complaints to the ECJ and this kind of things. So I think all of that complicates this question of mutual adequacy. But anyway, that seems to be the British position, is that they want a situation where you can have mutual adequacy decisions under a GDPR type framework.
Mr. Steinke with Google Brussels. You already mentioned this, but I don't know, just to make sure, the true benefit of the Commission proposal, specifically for SMEs and startups, is that, in comparison to the large enterprises, is that purely that the proposal allows these small and medium enterprises and startups to freely choose the location of storage and data processing that is the cheapest?
There are cloud providers in the room. I'm only acting director, I'm actually head of unit for cloud, so my job is to pump every day the importance of cloud. But there aren't just cloud solutions. What about somebody who decides actually that they're going to invest in a small server, and that's the best way to run their online app? But if you have to invest in a second server because you want to go across the border from the Netherlands to Belgium, or from Germany into Denmark, that's hugely expensive. So it's not just about those services, and it's not just about the cheap cloud services, although of course we really do want, because again, I mean, you've heard somebody who knows much more about the reality, that this is what the startups need to be able to do. They need to be able to just pass that all over to somebody else. So it is to benefit everybody, but it is ease of operation, because in some cases it may be necessary to have all of the data in one place simply because that's the nature of the service of the application. It might be a data-driven application where crowd data or whatever is necessary to enable the service. We shouldn't be in the business of guessing or finding specific cases. It should be for everybody.
Okay, we're actually over time, so unless there's a burning question, I'll wrap up. If you want to mill around and network afterwards, please do. As I said, I'm really pleased to see so many of you here, and I think for our next event, I'm going to book a bigger room. But thank you very much.